There is now a raging debate about whether Joe Biden should step aside from the presidential race because of his disastrous debate performance on June the 27th. Barack Obama has come to Biden's defense, reminding us that he himself had a horrible debate against Mitt Romney back in 2012. So, of course, one bad night does not mean a candidate should bow out. But there are two definitive responses to Obama's argument. The first is that Obama's bad night was just a one-time lapse that could be overcome with better preparation for the next debate. Biden's bad night revealed what had been widely suspected, that his faculties had failed and were still failing fast. It was not about his debating skills. It was about an overall loss of mental acuity. June 27 was not a one-time screw-up. It revealed a permanent problem. And the second reason is that Biden was already losing the election before the debate. And as you will hear in my discussion with my guest today, he was losing the election because of some fundamental flaws in how he was campaigning. I would argue some fundamental flaws in how he approaches governing itself. The catastrophe of the debate now overshadows his prior weakness, but put together his mistakes before the debate with the miserable debate, and the need for him to step aside, in my view, becomes undeniable. The senior political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal is Molly Ball. She's famous for not pulling her punches. For instance, when I sat down with her in my recent interview, she cut to the chase.
Joe Biden is losing this election. So why is that?
Well, that sure is a doozy of a good question. I'll bet you've heard folks in the media say that Biden needs to shore up his base, in particular among the youth vote, by giving out more student loan relief here at home and internationally by abandoning his support for Israel and its war against Hamas. Ball and I examine those claims and test them. But before we get into it, I think it's crucial to realize there is not a wholesale rejection of Democratic candidates going on. When you look at the 7 swing states that will determine the election, there is a huge gap between Biden's vote and the support for Democrats running for Senate. To make this vivid, the widest spread is in Nevada, where Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen is leading her Republican opponent by 7 percentage points, at the same time that Trump is romping all over Biden by 9 points. Total it up, that is a 16-point spread between the Democrat running for president and the Democrat running for Senate. So Biden's weakness is not an overall Democratic weakness. It does not seem that we are headed to a sea change election. So then the question arises, just what is Biden's weakness? Molly Ball, welcome to the Political Conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Your article discussed Biden's attempts to woo the left into support for him. And I don't think we need to spend a great deal of time hashing over the polling, which has been dreadful and clearly shows the need for something to happen on the Biden side. Why did you choose the topic you did?
Well, it was really based on that polling that you mentioned. I mean, if we look at these polls, what we see is Joe Biden is losing this election. So why is that? And if you look at the subgroups and how he's polling with the different groups, in particular, he won the last election, he's losing this one. So who are those voters he has lost? There is some tranche of the electorate that voted for Joe Biden last time, but doesn't plan to do so this time. So who are those people? And looking at our own polling and others and analyzing those crosstabs, what we see is that they are independents, they are more centrist or conservative leaning independents. But then when you look at Biden's rhetoric and the policy moves that he's made, they see, and frankly, a lot of other analyses that I wrote this article in part to rebut, there has been this idea that he's got to do more to shore up his base. And that the way to do that is to take more liberal policy actions, whether it's actions like forgiving student loans or, signaling liberalism on economic policy, foreign policy, and other areas. Uh, there seems to be this, what I would argue, an incorrect consensus in some quarters that he's got to basically bring the left back to him to win the election. Whereas I think if you look at the numbers, that's just not the case. The voters that he needs to win back in order to beat Trump again are those voters in the middle.
So the move to the left. I'm sorry. So how does it happen? I'm asking complete speculation at this point. This is a deeply experienced person. Joe Biden has been doing politics for literally generations, plural. Um, what leads to a guy like Joe Biden who won the 2020 election largely by identifying himself with the American center to do this?
It's such an interesting question, and I don't think we fully know the answer. I mean, if you look back over Joe Biden's, half century in American politics, one thing he's always been very good at is finding the center of the Democratic Party, right? And the way he was able to win that primary in 2020 was really by unifying the Democratic Party behind him, including through overtures to the left, to Bernie Sanders and his movement. I think a lot of Democrats looked back on 2016 when Bernie Sanders, didn't endorse Hillary Clinton until the convention, and even then seemed to do so sort of grudgingly, and felt that that was an important misstep. Whereas, Biden, as a senator, as vice president, always had a good relationship with Bernie Sanders, brought him and his movement into the fold, and got them to support him. So I think part of it may simply be Biden's instinct as a Democrat for reaching out to other Democrats and having the Democratic Party behind him. Biden coded as a moderate in 2020 uh, because so many of the other Democrats were running to the far left. And so it didn't take a lot of centrism to be the moderate candidate in that particular field, right? You had, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and a whole host of other candidates taking quite left positions. And I think a lot of analysts would say that compared to other Democratic presidents in history, even a Bill Clinton, a Barack Obama, that on policy, Biden has been quite liberal. So everything's relative. But I'm not in his head. I don't know what he's thinking. I think there's another theory going around that, you hear the sinister version of this a lot on, say, Fox News, that Biden is sort of being puppeteered by the radical left, that they're the ones really pulling the strings and he's not really running the White House. I don't think that's true based on our reporting. But I do think that there are a lot of young staff in the White House and on the campaign who are probably further to the left than uh, the man who calls himself Blue Collar Joe, and who has always been part of this sort of more, working class union tradition in the Democratic Party. A lot of the staff of the Democratic Party and of the White House and campaigns these days comes out of progressive activism, comes out of the progressive nonprofit organizations who advocate for liberal positions on issues. And I thought it was very interesting when the president himself seems to be trying to signal that he wants to get tough on immigration and on the border. But in a recent interview with the Washington Post, his campaign manager said, "You will not hear the president talk about shutting down the border," which is something he has, in fact, actually said. But it's clear that the person running his electoral campaign has a different view than he does on that particular issue, which we know is of very high salience to the electorate these days.
So I looked into some of the stats on border apprehensions. Number of times people were actually apprehended by the Border Patrol. And under the Biden administration, there had been a tremendous increase in apprehensions until December of 2023, around Christmas, when it hit an all-time record of hundreds of thousands of apprehensions in 1 month. And on December the 27th, 2 days after Christmas, Anthony Blinken and Mayorkas went to Mexico City to meet with Miguel Lopez Obrador, and something happened at that meeting, because within the next month, the number of apprehensions was cut in half and has remained at that level through February and March. We haven't heard April yet. But something happened at the meeting with Obrador, and Mexico began apprehending people on a mass basis and sending them to the center of Mexico. This I get from an advocacy organization for immigration, an organization that routinely argues in favor of loosened immigration standards. But they were very clear in what their theory was, that something happened at the meeting, and apprehensions had been cut in half. Joe Biden has said nothing about that. And I'm sitting here saying, wow, this is something which you could discuss, and there would be a whole heck of a lot of people very interested in how you had achieved this. And yet you've said nothing on it.
It's fascinating. And, immigration is an area where, in dozens of polls, we've seen that it's the number one or the number two issue that people believe is important in American politics in the current presidential election as it affects their vote. People being willing to accept solutions that at one time might have been thought very extreme: mass deportations, ending birthright citizenship, at the same time as, the conventional sort of Democratic Party solution, the comprehensive immigration reform, also continues to poll extremely well. In our poll and others, we had 70-80% of people saying that they would support, a pathway to citizenship and regularization of the current undocumented population. And what I think that signals is that more than anything, people just want something done to control the problem.
Yeah.
And I think that that is Biden's bigger political problem, is not any particular policy on any particular issue, but the feeling that the country is out of control, that the border is out of control, that the world is on fire, that there isn't a sort of steady hand on the till. I mean, he was elected as the alternative to another Trump term. And so many people felt that Trump was an unpredictable, a chaotic president, and that Biden would restore a sense of normalcy. And I think, Biden's approval rating really took a nosedive at the time of the Afghanistan withdrawal and has never recovered. And it was that in combination with, the second COVID wave at a time when we'd been told that that was over and done with and we could all come out of our homes, combined to make people feel that things were out of control and that normalcy was not going to be restored. And so, it's the same with when people talk about Biden's age, which we know is a concern to the overwhelming majority of voters. Again, it's less a numerical and actuarial concern, and more a sense that they're not convinced he's fully in command. And so I think, a president who could go out there and give a speech about this great achievement that's been done at the border and how we are, getting on top of the situation, doing things to solve it, would potentially be more popular than the one that we have. A president who, we asked this question in our last Wall Street Journal poll, and immigration, famously complex and difficult and multifaceted problem. And as you note, has its roots in foreign policy and in crises all over the world. It's not simply a matter of American border policy. So when we ask this question, the latest political gambit of Biden and the Democrats has been to try to take credit for the failed bipartisan border policy deal in
Yeah,
the Senate and say,
yeah,
see, we tried to solve the problem, and those
yeah.
nasty Republicans led by Donald Trump would not let us. Uh, and so we asked people, which of these is closer to your view that, Biden and the Democrats backed this compromise, but Trump wouldn't let them do it, or that, Biden undid Trump's border policies when he took office, allowing the situation to get out of control. And people overwhelmingly, or at least by a pretty wide margin, chose the second option, which again to me says they are looking for the president to do something about it. They are not looking for him to say, well, I had a policy and I wasn't able to implement it.
I have to say to you, you've been immersed in political life for a bunch of your life, and I certainly have also. The whole idea that the American electorate is following those debates with that kind of minute attention to detail, didn't unable to get it through the Senate, although there was consensus on this and consensus on that, and all this took place half a year ago. That is unbelievably naive and out of touch with the reality of the situation. Folks have a really hard time keeping up with anything going on at the moment. And to think that that argument would actually change people's minds baffles me. But I wanted to comment on a way that I approach it, and it's not so much. It's the indecisiveness of the Biden administration that I think is enormously aggravating to folks. And let me give you an example. Way back to the primary race in 2020, in I think the very first debate where all the candidates were lined up, and Julian Castro explained his open borders proposal and why it was sensible. Workers were needed, it would be good for the economy, a litany of good things. And the moderator said, if you're for this, raise your hand. And every one of the candidates raised their hand, with the exception of Joe Biden, whose hand went up, and then it went down, went up, and then it went down. And he never got to a point where the hand was really still. He just couldn't make up his mind on what to do about it. And I look back on that episode, and it to me seems the hand is still going up and down.
Wow, I had forgotten that, but it's such a devastating metaphor for the current situation because, we've repeatedly heard and we've reported and others have reported that they're about to do a big executive action on immigration. Uh, and they're perpetually about to do it. It's going to make them look tough. It's going to crack down on the border. It's going to show the American people that the president sees this as a problem and wants to do something about it. Well, we're still waiting. So, and we've gotten various explanations for this. There are concerns about the legality of taking executive action on something that is supposed to be Congress's purview, or, there's fear of blowback from the progressive activist groups or from internal, disputes in the administration between more liberal and more centrist views on this issue. But as you say, what it adds up to, I think, is a picture of an administration that can't make up its mind. I think some of this is also specific to immigration. Joe Biden, over half a century in politics, has been involved in many, many issues. Obviously, has had chaired in the Senate, chaired the Judiciary Committee, chaired the Foreign Relations Committee, knows a whole lot about foreign policy, and we've seen that play out throughout his term as president, as he's taken a very forceful hand on these different foreign crises and so on. I think immigration specifically is an issue that was just never part of his specialty, just never part of his skill set. And so for the first, couple years of his administration, he seems to have felt like he could more or less ignore it. And so it just got to a point where it became this, and famously for the first year plus would not call it a crisis. And there was a sense that if they ignored it long enough, it might go away. And instead, it got to the point where they couldn't ignore it any longer.
So let's just turn to one of the other major issues that has come up, and that is the war between Israel and Hamas. And Biden has, I'm going to use another analogy here about how I sense Biden thinks he's doing things. There's an old political story frequently told by Jerry Brown on how he wanted to govern. He called it the canoe theory. If you want to steer the canoe, what do? You paddle a little bit on the left, and then you paddle a little bit on the right, and sure enough, the canoe goes in a straight course somewhere. I suspect in Joe Biden's mind, there's a little bit of the canoe story playing out on the Israel situation. He goes to a Holocaust memorial ceremony recently and delivers a heart-stirring speech about never forgetting. And within, 10 days or so after that, announces that he is going to cut off a major part of Israeli funding for the war in order to prevent bombing in Rafah. That's a lot of bit of paddling on one side and a little bit on the other, but I suspect he thinks he's in a canoe steering a straight course of some sort.
Well, look, obviously, uh, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is another one of these incredibly complex problems that has stymied efforts to solve it for decades. So far be it from me to sit here and tell anyone that there's an easy course. And this is
There isn't.
obviously quite politically complicated as well for the president. I think he has been surprised, whether or not he would admit it, by this uprising on the left over Gaza, the tremendous amount of sympathy that exists now on college campuses, in particular on the progressive left, that has for the last couple of decades really been integrating the idea of Palestinian liberation into this intersectional ideology that they've been incubating. I don't think that's something that the president was fully prepared for when, as you remember, at the very beginning of the war, he came out very strongly, was the first president to visit Israel in wartime and articulated a very deep loyalty to Israel, and then has seemingly been sort of gradually backing off that either ever since, whether it's because of the way he perceives Bibi Netanyahu's behavior, or because of his own domestic political considerations, or some combination of the two. Uh, but we hear a lot about how concerned he and his advisors are about the votes in Michigan, where there is a large Arab American vote, and where uh, lawmakers like Representative Rashida Tlaib, who comes from the uh, Palestinian community in Dearborn outside Detroit, have warned in very strong terms, and I've interviewed her about this, that the president is going to lose the state because of his approach to this issue. And so that is a view that he should be less supportive of Israel. But again, if you look at the polls, if you look at the actual center of American public opinion, American voters continue to pretty strongly support Israel. That's not to say they support Israel's conduct in the current conflict. That's not to say they don't want to see this conflict end sooner than later. Uh, but uh, but it's not the case that, certainly the campus protesters, or even, the liberals who are telling the president to back off, that they are necessarily in the center of American public opinion. So uh, again, I think there's a risk that by moving too far to the left on this issue, the president risks losing the center.
And the argument I hear continually is that for various reasons, the Israel-Hamas issue is one that, if he handled it "quote unquote" correctly, would move the youth vote into the Biden camp. But the polling I see was a bit startling on that. The When asked, do you think the United States is doing too much to support Israel, or do you think the United States is doing too little to protect Palestinians? Young voters said, well, 41% think they're doing too much to support Israel, and 34% think the U.S. is doing too little to protect Palestinians. You compare that to the the Democratic electorate at large. 40% think the United States is doing too much to support Israel, and 47% too little to protect Palestinians. Well, those numbers, if taken on their face, say that youth vote is less oriented to a position that's favorable to the Palestinians and critical of Israel than are Democrats as a whole. So there's strikingly little concrete evidence, it seems to me, that the Israel-Hamas vote issue is one that goes to the heart of the entire youth vote. Um, and I suppose if we did a tote of the total number of folks who've been involved in protests nationwide, either directly or supportive, it's not that many folks, but they sure got a lot of attention.
Well, and that's the purpose of protests, right? It's to
Right.
leverage a sort of asymmetric power, asymmetric, ability to attract attention to your cause. Uh, but I think your previous comments about the extent to which people are paying close attention to the issue also applies, because you know broadly, American voters don't approve of the way the president has handled this conflict, but it's not clear that that's because they want him to sort of torque to one side or the other. Uh, and again, I think it goes back to this idea that it's just not clear he has a handle on it, and because he's not able to be out there presenting an image of strength and vigor and commanding the bully pulpit and giving these sort of clear voiced uh, articulations of where things stand and what he believes the country should do. I think people just don't have a clear sense of what his North Star is in this conflict, what his goals are, what he's trying to do, how he's trying to do it. So, in some of the polling I've seen, uh, there is a large number of voters who say that the president hasn't handled the conflict well. But if you ask, why is that? Is it because he's been too much on one side, too much on the other side? That's sort of a wash. It's much more just this feeling that things are out of control and whatever he's doing isn't working.
And I would add that, although this is an electrifying, important issue, it's not one that we see the electorate saying it's one of my top issues. The
That's right. No, that's such a good point. And I meant to mention that as well, and including with the youth vote, right?
Yeah, Harvard does an annual youth poll, and they ask people on a dozen different issues, how do you rank them? And I was struck by the results. Israel-Palestine situation ranked next to the very bottom of importance to the young people who were interviewed. The top issues is what really surprised me, though. The top issues for young folks 18 to 29 years old: inflation, healthcare, and housing. Now, you could have told me that that had been a poll of 45 to 60-year-old voters, and I would have said, yeah, of course, that's exactly right. Throw in Social Security at the very end, and maybe you'd have it all wrapped up. The youth vote sounded very much like everybody.
Well, look, young people are adults, and the majority of people in this country still do not attend college. So even in the 18 to 22-year-old bracket, you're mostly talking about people who are trying to forge a life on their own, move out of their parents' house, and maybe, start their first job, afford an apartment, maybe start a family. And so, of course, cost of living is going to be top of mind, potentially even more so than for an older, more established person who's already got, a salary and a mortgage. And it's harder than ever to buy a house when mortgages are at 8%.
It sure is. So, forgiving student debt maybe doesn't go to the heart of that.
Well, that Harvard issue ranking that you list, what was so interesting was that, yes, I think Israel-Palestine was number 12 out of 13, and student debt forgiveness was number 13.
Yes.
So
Yes.
for all of the
You
hype
read it.
about how this is supposed to be the issue that wins over young voters, they're
Yeah.
saying actually they don't care.
Well, you throw in marijuana, though. You understand there's a nexus between student debt relief and reclassification of marijuana from extremely dangerous to harmless.
What's the
You hadn't
nexus
heard about?
there?
Oh, the Biden administration actually began when he came into office a process of reclassifying where
Oh, sure, I
marijuana
know about that.
falls.
I just don't
Yeah,
understand what it has to do with student debt.
not a darn thing.
Oh, okay.
It is supposed to be it is supposed to be a way of garnering support among young voters,
Mhm.
and that's the way the Biden administration has presented it a great deal.
Well, and marijuana legalization is overwhelmingly popular with voters overall. This is an issue that's seen a pretty rapid trajectory from sort of being seen as taboo a couple of decades ago to really widespread acceptance. Particularly, it's now legal in a lot of states, and there doesn't seem to be too much buyer's remorse about that. People seem to be pretty in favor of it.
Precisely, there's no great hubbub about it, and I know folks who support Joe Biden strongly and think therefore it's a salient issue. I actually think the opposite is true. It has become so routine, so expected, so not something that inflames arguments between parents and kids that changing the classification is expected, and it doesn't really say, well, it's more important than inflation this month.
I haven't seen any evidence of a backlash to that particular announcement by the administration. I just wrote an article about the 20-year anniversary of legal same-sex marriage. And I
Mhm.
think there's a not precise analogy there, but that's another one where, since same-sex marriage became the law of the land with the Supreme Court decision in 2015, uh, public acceptance is through the roof. It's now nearly 3/4 of Americans believe that this should be legal, to the point where you don't see any meaningful political opposition. There may be, Republicans who will vote against it if it comes up, but nobody's seeking to make this a salient issue in a campaign for the reason that it's just not something people are really riled up about.
I always, when I heard about that, it struck me. I think in the old days when the right wing thought that same-sex marriage could be used as a weapon against Democrats running for office, they thought so because marriage is so central to the social structure and to people's conceptions of normalcy. But I always thought, and I think it has proven true, that for the gay movement to embrace marriage, an ultimately normal thing to do, would move their cause to the center of being a normal American, away from, if I remember correctly, the bathhouse days of the movement, just prior to the outbreak of the AIDS epidemic. So it was a absolutely wonderful thing for the movement to do, because Americans saw them as wanting to be included in America, not excluded.
Well, and I covered the marriage movement for many years, and I think that's exactly right. And in many ways, it's sort of a conservative thing to want, right?
Yes.
And the movement became successful largely by making a sort of conservative family values argument, saying stable families are the basis of a flourishing society, and we want to be a part of that. And that was a lot of what led to this widespread acceptance. And in my article, I quoted a lot of uh, members of gay couples, gay families who are normal parts of their communities like any other family. And I think it's had a seismic effect on the acceptance of LGBT people in our society.
So let me use that as an entree to touch on an issue that many Democrats think is the salvation of the Biden administration, and that is abortion. And with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, a tremendous change in American politics took place, and I think we are still struggling to even invent the categories to think about how that change works. The old categories of the debate when Roe v. Wade was alive and well just don't apply. So let me throw this out in the sharpest way I can. Recently, a poll showed that, and was billed as abortion is one of Donald Trump's biggest vulnerabilities because 64% of voters in battleground states were for abortion under almost all circumstances. And then they took a look at Trump's voters who said they were going to vote for Donald Trump. And 44% of them said, yeah, we think abortion rights should be available in virtually all circumstances. The reporters said, well, that just shows how vulnerable Trump is on the issue. And there's another way to look at it, and that is to say, well, Donald Trump has voters who disagree with a lot of his stances on abortion, on his views on abortion, and yet are with him. Does that show that it's a salient issue, or that it has become so deeply accepted so quickly that it's no longer really relevant?
Well, I don't think we know. I mean, something I keep emphasizing because I think it's easy to forget is that Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022. This is the first presidential election since the Dobbs decision. So we are quite literally in uncharted territory. It has never happened that we have had an American presidential election in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade. What we have seen, though, I mean, it's interesting. We're talking about, Biden moving to the center and finding ways to reach out to, independent and conservative-leaning voters. That is what we used to call triangulation, and it is very nakedly what Trump is doing on abortion. He has said the quiet part out loud, as he tends to do. He has said to the Republican Party, which contains, right, the overwhelming majority of rank and file Republicans are religious conservatives who believe very strongly in the right to life. And he has said to them, sorry, this issue is a political loser, and I'm not going to take your side. And I'm going to go out there and tell the electorate that I don't want to do what you want me to do. And I'm going, and so his message has been, now I think there's various things that he hasn't been clear on, and what Trump tends to do is sort of take all sides of an issue, right, and let people hear what they want to hear. But on this issue, he has, I think, first of all, because he doesn't come out of the conservative movement, because everyone knows that he was this, playboy, libertine, New York Democrat before he had a change of heart and became a Republican to run for office. He has that profile going for him. People know he's not a Mike Pence figure who comes out of the pro-life movement, that this is not a matter of personal conviction for him. Uh, and so he is the man who caused Roe v. Wade to be overturned, and he's taken credit for it. And Biden campaign will spare no expense in making sure that American voters know that this is his fault. But he is working very hard to message to the electorate that as president, he's not going to do anything about it, not going to do anything more about it. Now, I think those of us who follow politics closely know that that's not the end of the discussion. There's various executive actions that can and will likely be taken that could further circumscribe women's choices. That when you say this is being left to the states, what that opens up in practice is that in large numbers of large swaths of the country today, including virtually all of the American South, abortion is functionally outlawed. And you have situations like what recently happened in Arizona, going back to a law from the 19th century that would have prohibited all abortions with no exceptions. So all of those consequences are the potential result of the stance that Trump has taken, but he is working very hard to signal to the electorate that he's not on the far right in this issue. And that's why I think it will be more difficult for the Biden campaign to make this a salient issue and convince people that this is the central issue of the presidential election.
Yeah, the Biden campaign can certainly succeed in convincing people that it's something they should be thinking about, but I'm not sure they can dictate what the thoughts will end up being.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the political conversation. I really appreciate your work and look forward to hearing your voice as the campaign rolls along.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.